I'd like to welcome you all to this event for Toby Manning's masterful Marcusian musicology, mixing pop and politics, a history of popular music from doo-wop to drill. Let's give it a hand up for Toby, please. Okay, I'm going to start off with kind of a basic one, the life universe and everything. A Marxist history of popular music. Okay, we just heard Billy brag. We know there's plenty, we're also quite familiar with a lot of popular songs that use Marxism, have a directly political message. But Toby, your method in this book is, in a way, kind of more Marxist than a Marxist song in a way, because you're going to dig deep sort of beneath the history of popular music to try and dig up some of the political heartbeats that really drive our music taste, our music production, and indeed the wider cultural spirit of our time as expressed through music. So tell us a bit more about the method of this book, why you're taking music in this kind of directly political way, and rather than doing a history of Marxist popular music, why a Marxist history of popular music?
Well, I mean, one easy answer to that are the words Dorian and Linsky. He's already written a book about 33 and third revolutions per minute. That's a history of protest songs. So that kind of already exists. And I would argue it probably comes from a liberal perspective, because I think a Marxist sees politics as infusing almost everything. It became almost a challenge to myself. How far can I go with this? Can I find politics in ABBA, etc. So, so I just found that idea of how, particularly the sort of waves and currents of the socio-political world were sort of communicating themselves, often possibly quite laterally, or through popular music. And could I spot it? If I listened to songs that I'd listened to all my life without ever thinking they had any bearing on their particular socio-economical, socio-cultural moment, could I pick out little sort of strands? Might be a choice of words, a choice of imagery, just sort of coincidences in the narrative and stuff like that might sort of chime with that.
Has there really been a piece of popular music you've encountered that you couldn't find the political undertone underneath? Not counting Twinkle Twinkle Little Star.
Yeah, I suppose there's some of the sort of every once in a while. Yeah, I think I did wrestle with trying to make Don McLean's Vincent a text in the book, and in the end I just sort of gave it up. But I probably could, given enough time. But the clock was ticking.
So I want to talk about, in a way, what ways in which music and politics come inside, because there's a more immediate form first and foremost, and I apologise, I'm going to use Black Sabbath as a paradigm because they're the best at it, and they have 19 studio albums, all of which are amazing. Firstly, just talking about, because Black Sabbath's a good example. So first and foremost, we have lyrics. Lyrics is one of the most basic ways we see pop and politics mix. They carry amazing hegemonic messages, they become refrains that we can chant, and I hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow when we go to tell Tommy Robinson to fuck back off. And there'll of course be a lot of music and chanting there. But we also have the aspect of context, sort of the cultural unconscious of where we're coming from, which is, for Sabbath was Birmingham, post-industrial Birmingham, still very much destroyed by the remnants of the Blitz, or the bombing campaigns. The Blitz was I guess, specifically London. And then we've got the fact the music itself is determined by very strong material factors. So the reason why they tune their guitars so low is because the guitarist Tony Iommi, he worked in a steel mill, worker protections not fantastic, his fingertips were cut off, and he had these very sensitive, essentially, nubs at the end of his hands, and so he had to tune his guitar down. And, hence we get all of the lovely Gothic things we know and love and appreciate this time on Halloween. So in terms of when you go to the text, the politics of in music, what sort of fronts are you approaching it from? Is it just lyrical? Are we sort of instead tracing a narrative through kind of unconscious aspects in the culture? How do you navigate those different strands and giving a history? Because, there's that sort of the implicit, the explicit, and then the wider unconscious and I guess libidinal, to go a little bit to psychoanalytic there, aspects of it.
Yeah, the lyrical there's always a danger for people with a sort of background in sort of literary and cultural studies like myself to sort of focus on lyrics above everything else. I'm aware that's a sort of inbuilt flaw. But there are two strands to that. There's the sort of the obvious and overt political lyric, like, Billy Bragg or Public Enemy or whatever. And then there's the much more kind of there's something more subtle, like my favourite example is Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, and the way that the lyrics of that, once, if you don't know that it was released just shortly after The Summer of Love in 1967, you might not think anything of it. But it's just, there's the little things of, people stopping and shaking hands are really saying, I love you. That's not a kind of a standard sentiment. It's certainly not something you'd hear in a song now. It's a very kind of like quite a hippie sentiment you wouldn't expect to come out of the mouth of Louis Armstrong. So lyrics can work in quite lateral or subtle ways. Sometimes I think it's sort of, and sometimes in sort of imagistic ways, like even though PJ Harvey's Let England Shake came out before the England riots of 2011, in the same year as the England riots of 2011, there's an album called Let England Shake, which is full of, images of sort of militarism and revolution and sort of and soldiers and sort of death and destruction. So, it's just like there's a sort of confluence there that's what when we recall structures of feeling. But yeah, I am very interested in the grain of music as well, the way that that sounds and feelings, like for instance, the sort of ubiquitous auto-tune sound on vocals that from around the mid-2000s onwards. I mean, I've got a sort of rather kind of convoluted explanation for how that fits in with what I call the resilience mode, which became the sort of dominant emotional affect after the crash, that basically whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that notion. And I have this sort of notion that sort of sound of the sort of damaged but also repaired voice that you kind of hear as auto-tune. It sort of sounds vulnerable, but you're hearing the process of sort of correction, as it were. So I make this sort of elaborate argument that that's sort of related to that sort of sense of resilience, where we were all basically being taught, essentially, how to deal with the after effects of the crash, because we certainly, nothing was going to be made better. We just had to live with the situation as it was. So I think that might be an answer to your question.
Well, let's pick up on resilience, actually, because I feel like the cultural aspect of resilience, I mean, there's a great book, also on Repeater, actually, for as long as it still exists, which has a big critique of resilience, which is essentially this idea that we will be resilient in the face of climate change, and resilience and sometimes ends up being counterposed in certain narratives against resistance. Because if you're resilient, you don't need to resist it, because it won't affect you, it won't hurt you. And we can kind of see this in a way sort of with the girl boss pop of someone like Katy Perry, and how that that doesn't really swing anymore. In terms of, I mean, do you think there's something of a resistant element to music? Is there a dynamic between music that gets you through the day by telling you that you've got this, you can do it, pump up, montage bollocks, or is it more is there a contrary fraction, let's say, to the way we talk about music, which allows us to give us a kind of sense of there's something beyond this. There's an imaginary. There's not to get too Mark Fisher, but there's something resisting the present that's latent in anything we talk about musically.
Yeah, I mean I'm getting quite a lot of feedback in my speaker here. There's. I think I would want to make quite a sort of spirited defence of escapism. I think, really, in general. I mean, it has its pitfalls. So does everything. But I do think that yes, we have to face up to political situations. So I think sort of pure sort of escapism, where we're just sort of like like I said, this sort of resilience mode whereby we're trying to sort of blank everything out and just sort of toughen ourselves up to deal with the sort of capitalist realism. So go back to Mark Fisher. But I do think there are times when just to defy the imperative, just to live and work and survive, in a sort of grit-tooth determined way. I mean, therefore, I think that does have a utility, and obviously the famous example would be, I guess, disco, which was to some extent an escape from the defeats of '68, quite overtly so. It was a turning away, but it became a kind of facing up to in the process as well, and it spawned so many different things from new areas of black culture, new areas of queer culture. and developed whole, and those then encroached back upon the mainstream. And so you have this whole sort of takeover, a sort of countercultural takeover of the 70s from the margins, from the black and gay communities, that then has to be quite consciously repressed in the late 70s by the sort of, first of all, the sort of heterosexualization and whitening of disco via the Bee Gees and Saturday Night Fever. And I'm not slagging them off, because it had a lot of good things going for it as well. And then after that, the whole disco sucks movement, which then deliberately represses both queer incursion upon culture and black music in a sort of double whammy, of which MTV's sort of repression of black artists is just one example, I think.
Yeah, if people haven't heard or watched any videos from the disco riots, I believe they're on YouTube. It is a fascist spectacle. It was some sort of rock radio show telling people to come to this stadium in the States, can't remember where, sorry.
Chicago.
Thank you. Chicago, and then they just stacked records on top and burnt them. When you start doing that, burning the people that make them isn't far off. It has strong analogies to me of, for example,
Yeah, and the thing is, there were like Temptations records and stuff in there, and Aretha Franklin records. It wasn't like they were even just targeting the genre of disco. It got to a certain stage of like, records with black people on the cover. They go in the pile, So there was this definite sense of like these uppity countercultural forces need to sort of be pushed back down into their holes, I
mean, when it comes to the question of counterculture, then, how do you think music has developed in terms of how it stands in relationship to that idea of a counterculture? Because, in terms of, say some of the work I've done, basically, I feel like the problem for counterculture is not so much the music. To some extent, in terms of the way we consume it, we can now have access to any record ever made, more or less, through Spotify. The consumption is more individualized. And fundamentally, the problem is this: we don't have land. If without land, without venues, especially without community-owned venues, when it comes in terms of any community accountability of the music, in terms of any festival aspect to music consumption, there's a real risk there that it's just purely individualized and purely up to the whims of whoever happens to own the venue and what they want to put on. Do you think that the way that music is consumed and the kind of the more, it's always been capitalized upon, but sort of the way neoliberalism has taken music as a commodity, do you think that's changed the potential that music has for countercultural use in either a good or bad way? It doesn't have to be sort of absolute there.
No.
Right. Okay,
No, and I've got a long version of that as well. I'm a countercultural apologist, right? And I make no apologies for that. I see the counterculture is what is sort of erupting sort of in embryo in the 50s, is realised in the 60s, and like I said, there's a sort of next stage backwash dissemination throughout the 70s, and it's very, very deliberately killed off in the 80s, along with a whole series of other sort of, of concurrent and contiguous 60s forces like worker power, and working class power. Which I would very much sort of I'd tie all those very much together as part of a wave. So the 80s and on deliberately repress what had been a collectivist spirit into a competitive individualist spirit, right? And that's very successful in all sorts of ways. But one of my little recurring motifs in the book is that no hegemony is ever complete, right? And so you can have something which is definitely kind of the market leader, but there are all sorts of other things, that other forces in dialectic, in response, in reaction, and resisting that all the way through, including sometimes within the most co-opted forms and genres and artists as well. They put out all sorts of curious counter messages. So part of my sort of counterculturality is a sort of embedded optimism. And so whenever I found my argument getting too pessimistic, I'd sort of bring myself up short. And I don't think this is just fanciful. I think an optimism of the will is like a crucial sort of political stance for Marxists. I think you have to keep digging in and finding areas for optimism and stop sort of surrendering to pessimism and sort of quietism. That's an easy way out. So what I see is happening, so definitely you have this encroachment in the 80s that then becomes more subtle and clever in the 90s by that sort of alliance between, sort of competitive individualism and a sort of air of progressiveness, right? But I think just throughout that, and whatever is thrown at the sort of rebellious spirit of the people as expressed through popular music, right, is always ultimately defeated. Not in an individual case. So the industry and capitalism will co-opt and crush in whatever way it can, whether that's the record company doing it, whether it's venues being closed down, whether it's certain rights to public assembly being limited, whether it's communities being flooded with smack or crack, whether it's communities being targeted by police, in all sorts of ways. But somewhere else, not necessarily there, somewhere else, something will erupt again. And that to me is is what happens in music, and it's a parable, as it were, or an allegory for the class struggle as well. We have to believe this. You cannot kill the sort of popular will and the sort of left-wing spirit in that sense, the radical spirit. You can crush individual instances of it, but it will bubble up again somewhere else.
It's kind of the inevitability of resistance, and to some extent, in a way, when it gets pushed into the underground, you're right, maybe there is a countercultural aspect there in terms of, even stuff like squatting. I mean, Mark Fisher and Kojo Eshin have a great point about the rave, right? When they say that because the rave is meant to be a site of enjoyment and it's also a site of literal law breaking, it essentially takes the anxiety one has before breaking the law and makes it enjoyable. That's what also they like about jungle music, because as they say, it's like getting chased by the fucking Terminator, but you really love it. And it's not just the drugs. I mean, sometimes it's just the drugs, but it's not always just the drugs. And sometimes the drugs can be helpful as well. It's a bit of acid and or ecstasy-based communism. And in terms of sites of resistance now, I mean, in terms of, let's start with recent musical scenes, I guess, and their attempt to try and talk about some of the biggest events in the past 20, I guess at this point, like 10, 15 years. And because this book is really good, particularly on the sort of year of 2016, songs like Childish Gambino's This Is America, Good Kid, Mad City, Kendrick, Stormzy, the kind of grime for Corbyn movement. How did you see that developing, and what sort of political pitfalls did it end up finding? Do all roads lead to Brat Summer, or was there something that we can say from it?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about both grime and hip-hop is they semi-contradict what I just said, in that they're both genres that got entirely co-opted, got sort of corporately owned and killed, but they were reborn, within the same place, as it were. So, both grime and hip-hop had more or less disappeared, I would argue, as recognisable genres by about 2008 or 9. They'd all sort of merged with EDM, electronic dance music, and sort of just become sort of pop. And it just seemed like that was the end of it. Just in a way, if you think about politically, it seemed like there was this sort of moment of possibility after the crash. Why will people won't stand for this? Surely they won't stand for this. And what did they do? They stood for it. Everything carried on much as it was before. There were no major changes as a result. So there was this sort of flat period from sort of 2011, 12. I mean, there was bits and pieces but going on, and then suddenly, just as sort of radical politics bubble back up again, so does both grime and hip hop, independently and interdependently. Yeah, and you have in America you have sort of Kendrick Lamar, I think, spearheading this, Childish Gambino, but even people like Beyonce. Taking a much more sort of radical, sort of Black Panther-y sort of stance suddenly, and you have sort of the sort of Bernie supporters who are John the Jules, I'm thinking of, and then in Britain, sort of in tandem with that, suddenly grime, which had been was completely sold out, just suddenly sort of re-streeted, as it were, but as a commercial force, and you've got Stormzy and Dave. And now, I don't know, Heady One, and all of these people suddenly becoming huge stars, having huge hits, with this very uncompromising vision the margins sort of rising up and asserting themselves in an increasingly racist and a sort of like society where racism was becoming increasingly conventionalized and acceptable. You had the deportations of the Windrush generation, the sort of hostile environment of that, all that was going on. All the sorts of comments that Boris Johnson was making in the press about pickaninnies and all the rest of it. So it was just like this quite, without ever needing to be overtly political, and grime was rarely overtly political, but it was political and in and of itself, just by being this assertive working class black culture, which nobody had said, this is okay now, let's do this. It came up through the streets of its own volition and was just an incredibly important assertion of sort of black British identity at that particular point.
I mean, drill was functionally illegal until Matt Hancock essentially legalised drill music. And then additional to that, we have, well, less Matt Hancock jokes, the better. But in terms of that particular moment then, in terms of a kind of counter-hegemonic musical force, which does become, it becomes co-opted in a way that, co-option isn't always necessarily the end of something's radicality. We can't, as you said, hegemony isn't always incomplete. And therefore, just because something has been sold doesn't mean it doesn't have any radical potential. As Lenin said, the capitalist will sell us the rope. But in terms of, just going forward in terms of a different but equally hegemonic force, and there's a spectre haunting any conversation about pop and politics, given who just got back together. So I just want to ask, Britpop, is it a psyop?
Sorry, I was still basically thinking about, now we've got to talk about when everything goes to shit again after 2020, and now we just managed to skirt that and skip back to 90s nostalgia.
Well, it still goes to shit, but in a classically goes to shit way.
Yeah. What's the question about?
Is Britpop a psyop?
Yeah, I think Britpop was one of the things I always think about, I never think that conscious co-optation or conscious psyop or conscious spookdom is anything like as interesting as the fact that as how ideology works. That that you came up with your own co-optation, as it were. That you came up with your own desire to sell out and or vote Liberal Democrat. It's just like. And you feel like you own it. You don't feel like anybody else, brainwashed you or anything like that. So, and it certainly wasn't a result of meetings behind closed doors, despite all the tease between the Gallaghers and Tony Blair. But that was all in the music and in the attitude anyway. Because the thing about Oasis is that, in particular, is that they harness. Because all these sort of 60s throwbacks, they harness this sort of feeling of counterculture, of the crowd, of the power of the crowd, of the pride and the desire instilled by having a working class background of of proving yourself. But they've got nowhere to go with that. It's just an individualized, He's got no answer to, do you know what I mean? That's his big song at the moment of their sort of triumph. They go to number one as Tony Blair arrives at Downing Street. And that's this sort of big Britpop, Cool Britannia anthem, which says absolutely nothing. But, I think there's a line about believe in yourself or something like that. It's just like, and that's all they really have. So, yeah, I mean, the desire to go back to the 90s, which has been, fostered endlessly by The Guardian for the last, 10 years in particular. Doesn't Hadley Freeman write this article every sort of 5 years or so? It's just extraordinary to me because I'll be honest, the chapter that I found the grimmest to have to write was the 90s chapter.
But that's all back to the 60s. The 90s was all about going back to the 60s.
It was, but without the content.
Yeah. The 90s was second hand.
Yeah.
It was the Kinks, the Beatles.
The Austin Powers generation.
Yeah, it was, but it was,
new.
Well, it did have something new, which was the evacuation of the notion of radical social change. That it sort of took the sort of collective, effective upbeatness of the 60s and just joined it to settle for the way things are. Let's not transform the world. Let's just celebrate the world as it is, but we'll feel really good about ourselves, you know. And yeah, and I suppose that does make sense, you know, when we're back in another period of, you know, even more stark sort of proposition that we should just make do with the status quo, just accustom ourselves to the lack of change, so we can all go to sort of big anthemic events and feel, you know, and sing in a big crowd about a load of upbeat kind of whoa-oh things about nothing.
That's why I think Brat is also kind of a Britpop album, if I'm honest. I think let's open it up after. Let's see one more. Let's open it up. And I think just want to end it on one final question, which is the place of, and I'm not expecting like a big organisational theory of music here, but the political left in this country has made great use of music, not only in the basic organisational sense of the IWW songbook, but also Rock Against Racism. I mean, formed famously against Eric Clapton, who should constantly be reminded of being a complete racist arsehole, for whom that group was founded. He might be on the other side of tomorrow's demo. If anyone sees Eric Clapton, I guess say hi or throw something. How should political movements aim to sort of not manipulate, but make use of popular music and musical space? Because left organisations rarely put together musical spaces now. I mean, in terms of Rock Against Racism, that's kind of more or less completely fizzled out. There are, of course, there are some aspects of land here. I mean, if Pelican House became a gig venue, I don't know, there are potential options there. How should we aim to use music in sort of consciousness raising and even potentially movement building today?
I mean, it's a slightly contrary to the way I approach music, but it doesn't mean that I am against the sort of conscious raising and sort of protest aspect of music. I think it's important. And, having been attending these Palestinian rallies for a year now, I have noticed the gradual tailing off of musical content in these events, which is sort of disappointing, because it is, the reason Oasis used this sort of thing is that it's an effective tool of sort of crowd bonding, and of and makes you feel empowered. So it's a shame that only the kind of the centrists and the right are using that, because there's all these sort of MAGA or horrible MAGA country songs around at the moment that are becoming huge hits that are sort of that are working on people in that respect, and the left seem to have opted out, and those that might not and grime has gone back to being apolitical, and hip hop has kind of quietened down and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think it's something that urgently needs doing. How it's done, it's not for me to sort of articulate. Yeah. But yeah.
Well, 1,000 rays bloom in that case. Toby, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Cheers. Thank you. Yeah.